Joining me in studio is Abby Martin and Mike Prysner. They did the movie Gaza Fights for Freedom. Yes. Welcome, guys. How you doing?
Great, Cenk. How are you?
Thanks for having us.
All right, good to have you guys back. Of course, Abby's been on the show a lot. Mike, good to see you again. And so you guys decided to do a movie about Gaza. Okay, first, why?
Sure, so Gaza, of course, is the largest open-air prison, 2.2 million people living there, 75% refugees, half children. So you have to keep in mind this is a war against kids, being bombed relentlessly under a medieval siege, being deprived of water, electricity, just basic human rights of freedom, mobility, right to life, et cetera. So we, after the Great March of Return sparked off a year and a half ago, which Cenk, you know, is still going on every single Friday, where Palestinians are going out there unarmed and still being sniped, mowed down by Israeli snipers. We were so shocked and abhorred by the media coverage of this, kind of apologizing for Israel, that I Skyped in with a session with Gaza journalists, and kind of the session arose out of, basically it ended up me saying, hey, we should do a documentary about this, after we directed all these interviews with the victims that were being shot and their families. We saw how epic this footage was, Cenk. I mean, it's really mind-blowing cinematic stuff that makes you feel like you're in the middle of the protest. So we took a year off and we made this movie.
So the movie's out now. It's called Gaza Fights for Freedom. You can get it at GazaFightsForFreedom.com. I'm going to show you or at least a portion of it in just a second. But understand the context that Abby's referring to. We covered on the show when it was happening. They would shoot doctors and they would shoot them from great distances, nowhere near the border, and medics and protesters, etc. And the media would be like, well, you say tomato, I say tomato. I'm like, no, there's no tomato. That was a doctor that they shot from a great distance for no reason. But it's not just about Israel. It's about state power must be protected by de facto state media. So that's why films like this are important, to get you the real message of what's happening. So let's take a quick look here at a little portion of the movie, and then we'll come back and talk about how it got done and what else is in the movie.
مش أكتر، هي صح رايحة وبعدين مسيرتنا مسيرة سلمية. ما احنا حاملين سلاح ولا إشي، بالعكس احنا بصدورنا العارية أمام قوة كبيرة من الجيش اللي هي مدرعاتهم وأسلحتهم وغازهم وطائراتهم. احنا مسيرتنا سلمية، بنطالب بحقنا، من حقي يكون أنا إلي بلد، من حقي يكون لي بيت، من حق اللي متشردين في كل مكان هذول النازعين يرجعوا على بيوتهم. ما آن الأوان، ما كلهم قاعدين في العالم كله قاعدين وبتفرجوا علينا، كل واحد مرتاح. احنا عنا حصار، لا معابر شغالة ولا دنيا، وين بدهم يروحوا؟
So powerful images, obviously. And Mike, how did you guys get those images? How were you able to obtain all this footage?
Yeah, well, actually, we were in the West Bank in 2017 doing reporting. We stayed in the West Bank for about a month reporting there, and we were trying to get into Gaza. The Israeli press office, despite us having all of the necessary press credentials, we're working for a legitimate press organization, they denied us entry into Gaza on the basis that we were one, Iranian agents, which we don't know where that came from, and number two, that we were propagandists and not journalists. Again, despite having all the required press credentials. So we were really troubled by the fact that we couldn't get into Gaza to report ourselves. And so, as Abby mentioned, we connected with a larger organization of journalists in Gaza, and we hired a team of about 7 journalists there, and we started directing this through the blockade, right? And I think something that speaks to that story, that we had to do this, we couldn't go ourselves, we had to do this through this blockade, is that our co-producer in Gaza, incredible guy, we were on the phone with every day for a year, he had his name redacted from the movie because he was scared that if he had his name on the movie, that Israel would never let him leave Gaza, they would possibly retaliate against him in the country. And so that's how it came about. It was a true kind of collaboration between us and journalists who were there on the front lines, and they went out every single Friday to capture these images, risk their lives to do so, so that people in this country could see what's really happening.
Yeah, so let's note the irony of any government, including Israel, saying we only want the information we want out, and we were right to shoot those medics from a distance, but you guys are doing propaganda. Okay, hilarious.
Right.
And then secondly, the woman in there, Abby, talked about when are we going to get our own country? And look at this, speaking of propaganda, so what do you hear in American media all the time? Oh, some random Palestinian says that Israel doesn't have a right to exist. Or sometimes an important Palestinian says Israel doesn't have a right to exist. Guess what? Israel exists. Does Palestine exist? No. How come you never hear in the media, hey, one side actually doesn't exist. The people exist, but the country doesn't. So talk to me about how disproportionate that is and how that affects the Palestinian psyche as you guys cover this.
Sure. Well, one thing that the film covers, not only is it uncovers this amazing archival footage and really digs into the history, but also it kind of deconstructs and demolishes that myth that Gaza is this monolithic entity reigned by this, rule of terror by Hamas. I mean, it's a diversity of political factions. There's a mosaic of entities of all different stripes, right? So Hamas is not the one, it's not all of Gazans are standing behind Hamas. And also we kind of look at what does Hamas actually say in regards to Israel? I mean, their charter today actually accepts a two-state solution under the 1967 borders, and they reject anti-Semitism. If you look at the ruling coalition in Israel, it's the exact opposite, Cenk, as you know. I mean, Netanyahu's openly declared to annex the West Bank, and he says there will be no Palestinian state. So it's kind of flipped around, right? Where the media just paints it as Palestine wants to destroy Israel, when really it's kind of the other way around.
Right, well, look, it's not even the other way around. Palestine doesn't exist.
Right.
Like, we just have to establish that, right? So, and of course Netanyahu ran a racist campaign and it wound up costing him, which is great. And about Arab citizens of Israel, not just about the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and trying to delegitimize them as citizens of Israel, etc. And of course Hamas has done wrong things, terrible things, etc. But when Fox News and the American government and every other part of the American media focuses on what Hamas does wrong, okay, fine. But what it leaves out is a giant part of the equation, which is what about state force? What about state power, right? And so when the state says, no, you cannot have a country, you cannot control your borders, and if you get anywhere near the borders, we will literally murder you, right? But that's not terrorism. So let's talk about that.
Yeah.
So who did they shoot near the border in this time period? And I know some people were going towards the border, but there's confusion as to how far they were from the border, etc. So talk to us about that. Go ahead, Mike.
Well, we show the Israeli side in this film. We show the excuses that Israel's giving, and they base all the people that they killed, which is over 200 people, unarmed protesters, since the Great March started, 187 in 2018 alone. They have two justifications. One is that they are human shields, right? Well, human shield by the legal definition means someone's engaging troops with a gun and they're accidentally shooting them, trying to shoot them. There's been no guns at the demonstrations. There's been no one engaging Israeli troops with guns at the demonstrations. The other thing is that they are actively engaged in violence. Well, the only things you could construe as violence is throwing rocks at soldiers in like fortified bunkers, which of course pose no threat to the Israeli soldiers there. But the UN report, the UN investigation into the deaths of 2018. So we're not basing this off of just witness testimony, but what the UN found is that the majority of people killed were not even throwing rocks, we're not even breaking through the border fence, which of course is still a crime. You still can't shoot people for doing that, and they did anyway. But the majority of people killed were doing things like smoking a cigarette, sitting on a hill, talking on a cell phone, filming a demonstration, hiding behind a bin, an 11-year-old child. These are people who were shot in the head by Israeli snipers. These weren't accidents, these weren't collateral damage. These were the people who were targeted, doing things that weren't even involved in protest activity, just simply at the demonstration. And so what we try to do is present real indictment, because there's no accountability, right? You'd think any country that was able to kill 200 unarmed people in this kind of slow, methodical, calculated way, that there'd be some kind of accountability. If you believe in international law, you have to believe that they have to be held accountable in some way, and they really haven't.
And also, I think it's a misnomer to even call it a border. This is a partition militarized fence, basically blocking them from the lands that they were ethnically cleansed from decades ago, Cenk. And the main person who manifested the march, Ahmed Abu Artema, he's a 34-year-old poet. He basically says in his call to action when the march was created, he says, this is a symbolic action. No one is trying to actually storm the border fence. They are just trying to pitch tents to draw attention to the international community that they are still refugees 70 years later after the Nakba. And what Mike is talking about is very important, because it's not just civilians who were sniped in the head or torso, which was actually the majority of deaths in these 200 deaths that we're talking about. It's also protected categories under the Geneva Conventions: children, disabled, medics, and press. I mean, just imagine if it were the other way around. If Palestinians were hiding behind mounds of dirt and just sniping not only Israeli civilians, but press medics and children.
And people would go absolutely ballistic. And so look, you know when you need snipers? When you're shooting from a distance.
Yeah.
That's when you need snipers. So let's just settle that. And then let's take it in the context of America. Imagine if in the civil rights movement, when they were doing civil disobedience and they were unarmed and they were incredibly courageous and they walked to places that the local authorities told them not to walk to. For example, maybe a bridge in the middle of Selma, Alabama. Now we were all outraged and we passed the Civil Rights Act and we had a whole movement because they did a cavalry charge and they assaulted those poor people and they busted their heads open. But they didn't use snipers and they didn't execute them. And still this country moved, the entire country moved because of the moral outrage. Where is our collective moral outrage when instead of using batons, they literally use snipers to execute 200 people in the middle of civil disobedience? Guys, how many times did we ask Palestinians, do not do violence, do not do terrorism, instead do peaceful protests?
Yeah, right.
And here we are, and they kill them anyway.
Well, that's what Ahmed said. He said they always ask us where the Palestinian Gandhis. He said there's been 200 of them, Cenk, and they've all been shot.
So that is incredibly powerful. One last thing, because we're out of time, but if in fact powerful propaganda forces funded you guys, including Soros and the mullahs, how come you didn't raise enough money to get the film, fully financed? So what is the situation with your financing on the movie?
Well, unfortunately, Trump's devastating sanctions on Venezuela shut down our ability to work with Telesur a year and a half ago. So we raised all of the funds over the last year and a half to make this film, Cenk. As you know, this is a third rail issue. No one in corporate media really talks about this or dares to. And if they do, it's both siding the issue and obfuscating the reality. So we just raised money from grassroots donations, and we're still going on a tour across the country. We're going to Canada to try to mobilize efforts on the ground and really link and network together to really build this movement, not only against Israeli apartheid, but against the US government and the US war machine, Cenk, because we know that the US is subsidizing these atrocities with $10 million every single day.
Right, so if you guys wanna help in those costs of the movie, which are not fully covered yet, patreon.com/empirefiles. If you want to watch on demand, vimeo.com/ondemand/Gaza Fights, or simply GazaFightsForFreedom.com. All right, Abby Martin and Mike Prysner, thank you so much for joining us, guys. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks for watching this free clip of the Young Turks. Don't forget to become a TYT member today. For more exclusive content, join now at tyt.com/join.